He went jogging one night, and vanished for 10 years. Then, out of nowhere, he walked back into town, alive. But the man who returned wasn't the one who left. This is the story of Patrick Cage, and the mystery that refuses to die. When Patrick Cage walked into the Redwood County Sheriff's Office on a gray October morning, no one recognized him at first. His hair was streaked with gray, his face gaunt, his eyes cautious and glassy like someone not used to daylight. He was barefoot, wearing a torn jacket, and carrying nothing but an old keychain with the initials PC engraved on the metal tag. When the deputy on duty asked his name, he hesitated for several seconds before answering in a voice barely above a whisper, "Patrick Cage." The name sent a chill through the room. Patrick Cage had been missing for 10 years. The last time anyone saw him, he was 38 years old, clean-shaven, and jogging through a quiet Oregon neighborhood just after sunset. Now, at 48, he looked like a man who had walked out of another world. Once the news broke, reporters gathered outside the sheriff's office, and by nightfall, the story had gone national. The man who went jogging and returned 10 years later. Deputies questioned him for hours. Patrick said he didn't remember much, only that he had escaped. He didn't know from where, or from whom. When asked how he'd made it back to Redwood County, he said he'd been walking for days, following roads that felt familiar. His fingerprints confirmed his identity. His wife, Claire, was notified immediately. She had remarried 5 years earlier, after Patrick was legally declared deceased. When she saw the photos, she broke down, whispering, "That's him, but it's not." 10 years earlier, Patrick's disappearance had shaken the town of Redwood Falls to its core. On the evening of March 11, 2015, he left home for his usual 3-mile jog and never came back. His wife had served dinner at 6, watched him tie his shoes, and told him to be careful, the kind of casual exchange that gains tragic weight only in hindsight. He promised to be home by 7:30. At 8, she texted. At 9, she called. By midnight, the police were involved. Officers found his phone the next morning near Miller's Bridge, a cracked screen, one unsent message, "Almost home. I think someone's following me." The words haunted the case for years. They were the last trace of him. Footprints along the creek suggested he had stopped abruptly, tire tracks indicated another vehicle had been there. But no one had seen anything, and the local surveillance cameras captured only a blur of motion, a jogger, then a dark SUV. Investigators combed every inch of the area for weeks. The community volunteered, search dogs were deployed, drones scanned the forests. They found a single running shoe near the riverbank, oddly clean for where it was discovered, as if it had been placed rather than dropped. Then, nothing. No clothing, no body, no signs of struggle. When detectives searched Patrick's work laptop, they found a draft email, unsent and incomplete. It read, "If anything happens to me, check the numbers in the ledger." It wasn't supposed to be this way. That one line shifted the entire focus of the investigation. Patrick worked in the finance department of a mid-sized logistics firm and had recently told a coworker he was looking into billing discrepancies. Within days, investigators uncovered evidence of embezzlement inside the company's accounts, small, precise transfers that suggested a larger criminal network. One of Patrick's coworkers, a senior accountant named Eric Lawson, became a person of interest. Lawson had taken sudden medical leave just before Patrick vanished and disappeared himself 2 days later. His car was found abandoned in Portland with photocopied ledgers inside, showing proof of the embezzlement. But Lawson was never located. For years, the two disappearances were considered linked. Police believed Patrick had either been abducted for what he discovered, or that both men had been silenced by the same people who benefited from the fraud. When Patrick returned 10 years later, everyone expected answers. Instead, they found more questions. His medical exam showed he was malnourished, dehydrated, and bearing several scars consistent with restraints. Toxicology revealed trace amounts of synthetic sedatives in his system, drugs typically used in clinical trials or experimental sleep therapy. He had no memory of the past decade beyond vague fragments, a metal door, fluorescent lights, a voice telling him, "You shouldn't have looked." Agents from the FBI's Portland field office reopened the case, this time classifying it as a prolonged abduction. But inconsistencies began to emerge almost immediately. Patrick's blood work revealed recent exposure to modern pharmaceuticals unavailable when he first vanished. His fingerprints matched his file, but his DNA sample contained minor genetic variations, consistent with long-term exposure to radiation or gene therapy treatments. No one could explain why. When detectives asked where he'd been living or how he'd survived, Patrick's story changed each time. First he said he'd been held underground, then that he'd been moved around, and later that he'd agreed to something he couldn't remember. Investigators found it impossible to tell whether these inconsistencies were trauma-induced or deliberate. The one thing he repeated with clarity was this: "They told me not to come back." Claire met him for the first time since his disappearance 2 weeks after his return. It was arranged through law enforcement at a private hospital under observation. The meeting lasted 20 minutes. She described it later as surreal, like speaking to a stranger with her husband's voice. Patrick seemed distant, detached. He asked about their children, but when shown photos, his expression didn't change. The reunion ended abruptly when Patrick began shaking uncontrollably, repeating the phrase, "They're still watching." Investigators traced Patrick's movements in the days before he showed up at the sheriff's office. Surveillance footage from an Idaho highway rest stop captured him 2 days earlier, barefoot, eating from a vending machine, wearing the same torn jacket. He appeared thin but alert, looking at passing cars as if expecting someone. When officers canvassed the area, they found tire marks from a vehicle registered to a logistics subcontractor, one that had previously been tied to the same shell companies linked to Patrick's old workplace. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. The more the investigators uncovered, the more impossible the story became. His reappearance coincided with the reopening of several financial fraud cases tied to the same network he'd been investigating before vanishing. A whistleblower from a sister company had come forward just a month prior, providing new evidence that pointed to offshore accounts and falsified medical supply contracts, one of which had been signed by a P. Cage. When confronted with the documents, Patrick stared silently for a long moment before replying, "That's not me." But the signature matched his exactly. For weeks, public opinion turned. Some believed Patrick had staged his disappearance, perhaps even cooperated with those he once tried to expose. Others saw him as a victim of something far larger, a corporate experiment or forced confinement designed to keep secrets buried. The FBI remained silent, issuing only one statement: "The circumstances surrounding Mr. Cage's reemergence are under active investigation." 10 years after the night he went jogging, Patrick Cage returned home to Redwood County. But the man who came back wasn't the one who had left. His voice was slower, his posture hunched, his once steady hands trembling as though they remembered things his mind couldn't. What had happened to him during those 10 years, whether imprisonment, coercion, or something else entirely, remained locked behind his silence. As the investigation deepened, one question lingered above all: if Patrick Cage had truly escaped, why did it feel like he was still being watched? The first thing investigators noticed after Patrick Cage's return was how carefully he avoided certain subjects. When questioned about his years away, he seemed lucid, until they mentioned names from his old workplace. Then, something behind his eyes changed. He'd stop mid-sentence, his voice flattening as though rehearsed. The FBI agents conducting the interviews called it conditioning. They believed he'd been under some form of prolonged psychological control. What unsettled them most was that he appeared both fearful and protective, of someone, or something, he wouldn't name. The task force reviewing the case began with what little Patrick had said: a facility, white walls, voices through speakers. Cross-referencing that with missing persons data, they found 3 other cases, individuals who had vanished within the same 18-month window Patrick had. All three were mid-level employees in logistics or accounting firms that later appeared in the same money laundering network Patrick had once investigated. None of those people had ever been found. Federal agents widened their search radius, tracing Patrick's fingerprints and facial matches through medical facilities and border crossings. One partial hit surfaced from a private hospital outside Boise, Idaho, an unregistered clinic that had burned down 5 years earlier. A former nurse, tracked down in Nevada, recalled a patient named Paul Crane who fit Patrick's description. She remembered the man being heavily sedated, monitored by men who didn't look like doctors. When she was shown Patrick's photo, she said quietly, "That's him." He was scared of going home. When confronted with this, Patrick denied everything. "I've never been to Idaho," he said, though his blood work told another story: elevated levels of a rare anesthetic found in clinical sedation programs. Investigators began to suspect that Patrick's disappearance wasn't a single event but part of a longer operation, possibly involving coerced compliance. One internal memo described it bluntly: subject may have participated in or been used for financial data manipulation off-record. Possible internal coercion or behavioral conditioning. Then came the discovery that reopened every file. A cybersecurity analyst examining Patrick's recovered smartwatch data noticed hidden GPS fragments, records that predated his return. The coordinates led to a wooded property on the outskirts of Redwood County, abandoned for years. When agents searched the site, they found the remnants of an underground structure, concrete foundations, rusted metal stairs, and a single generator, long drained of fuel. Inside, spray-painted on one wall, was a word: return. No fingerprints, no personal effects, but traces of human DNA, multiple sources, were found in the dust. The samples were never publicly matched. In the weeks that followed, Patrick's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He stopped cooperating with authorities and refused further interviews, insisting that talking made things worse. The press followed him everywhere, forcing him into isolation. Local residents whispered about seeing him walking the streets late at night, staring at lampposts as though listening to something only he could hear. His wife, now remarried, asked for privacy, saying only, "He's not the Patrick I knew." 2 months after his reappearance, Patrick vanished again. This time, there were no tire tracks, no phone data, no unsent messages, just an open front door and a half-eaten meal on the table. Investigators found no signs of forced entry. The only clue was a note taped to the refrigerator, written in Patrick's handwriting: "Tell them I remembered." Search teams scoured Redwood County for weeks, but he was gone. Then, on a rainy night in March, a fisherman reported seeing a man standing on Miller's Bridge, the same spot where Patrick's phone had been found 10 years earlier. By the time deputies arrived, the bridge was empty, but they recovered a single item from the railing, a new smartwatch, identical to the one found a decade before. Inside was a brief audio file, recorded 3 days earlier. It contained the same sounds as the original recording: footsteps, breathing, and a voice saying, "Turn around." Only this time, the second voice was clearly Patrick's. Theories spread quickly. Some believed Patrick had been abducted again by the same people who'd taken him before. Others claimed he'd finally revealed too much and had been silenced for good. A smaller group, including one of the lead investigators, suggested something darker: that Patrick had been complicit from the start, that his return had been part of a cover-up meant to close the investigation for good. The missing 10 years, they argued, weren't captivity, they were cooperation. The official report concluded nothing. The FBI closed the case file under unresolved, subject missing. No body was ever found. But months later, a journalist obtained internal emails showing that several financial cases linked to Patrick's old company were abruptly dropped, and key evidence sealed. When asked why, a former agent replied, "We were told to stand down." It came from higher up. Claire moved away soon after. She declined all interviews except one, years later, for a documentary. When asked what she believed happened to her husband, she said softly, "I think Patrick found something too big to explain." And maybe he tried to come back before realizing it was safer not to. In Redwood County, locals still talk about him. Some say he was last seen at dawn, walking the park trail in the same direction he'd run that night years ago. Others claim to have found footprints along the creek again, fresh, single tracks that lead to the bridge and stop. Each March, on the anniversary of his disappearance, someone leaves a gray running shoe on the railing. No one ever claims it. The legend of Patrick Cage became part of Redwood County's folklore, a story of a man who went jogging, vanished for a decade, came back with secrets, and then disappeared once more. Whether he was a victim, a whistleblower, or something in between, no one could say. But one thing remained certain: the truth, whatever it was, never made it back home. 10 years gone, and he comes back a stranger. Was Patrick Cage a victim who escaped, or part of something darker? What do you think happened during those missing years? Drop your theory in the comments, I'll be watching. And if this mystery gave you chills, hit follow for more untold stories that still don't add up.